this hard Gemara. So we've got the question that we're dealing with is person. They brought before a person figs and grapes, and the question is, does he recite a bracha on it? That's really what the Gemara is talking about, and we've gone through this first part of the Gemara already like 3 times. So let's jump right into it. So we had 2 opinions. We had the opinion of Rav Huna, Rav Nachman. They both are on the same team. And they say that you have to recite a bracha before the figs and the grapes. You're eating them during a meal. You're going to recite a bracha on them before, but you do not recite a bracha on them after. Why? Because the Berachas Hamazon will fulfill the obligation of the after blessing. Now we had, on the other hand, we have another view, which is Rav Sheshes. Rav Sheshes says that you do need to recite a bracha before and after. And he gives this, he adds in this point. He says, because the only case where you don't recite a bracha afterwards is a case of pas haba b'kisnin. It's this other type of bread that's like a cake, and that's a case where you do not recite. That's the only case that you don't recite a bracha afterwards. And the commentaries we talked about to discuss what he really means about this pas haba b'kisnin. And Rashi explains, it's talking about after a meal, you eat this pas haba b'kisnin. It's really a side point here, because the main point is we're dealing with the figs and the grapes. Do you need to recite a bracha on them before or after or both or neither? And that's really what we're dealing with. And then on the side, Rav Sheshes comes in and throws in this idea. He says, and the only case where you do need a bracha afterwards is pas haba, where you recite a bracha before, not after. The only case would be pas haba b'kisnin. So he throws this in as a side point, but of course all the commentaries deal with what is the meaning, what is this law of pas haba b'kisnin. And we've been discussing this. We've mentioned that there are different opinions what pas haba b'kisnin is. Generally, it refers to some type of cake or a pretzel, and according to Rashi, for some reason, you don't recite an al hamichya afterwards. It seems maybe you do recite a bari nefashis afterwards, but you don't recite an al hamichya. And there is one of the commentaries explains it as follows. One of the commentaries, and this is actually an important commentary, it's important to know this law. What we're dealing with is how much does a person need to eat in order to recite an after blessing? So generally we say a kazayas, the size of an olive. Of course, that itself is debatable what that means. What is the size of an olive? Are the olives of today? There's many different sizes that olives come in. And are the olives of today the same size as the olives of the days of yore? And this is itself a discussion, but let's just say the size of an olive is what you need to recite an after blessing. So you now have some type of cake that has a lot of walnuts and almonds in it, and spices and other foods. So you've got a mixture of flour and many other items. And we once mentioned that anything that has flour in it that's cooked into a cake is always going to be mizainis, right? We've said that before. Kol sheyesh by mechameshas haminam, anything that has from the 5 species in it, from the grains. So 5 mine dagan. Kol sheyesh by mechameshas mine dagan, anything that has from the 5 types of grain in it is always going to be a mezainis bracha. But what about the after bracha? The after bracha, you need a kazayis. Now, how much of that cookie needs to be flour to recite an after blessing of al hamichya? To have the typical after bracha of eating cake would be al hamichya. But what about if the cake has so much chocolate in it? It has so much chocolate filling, and it has so much nuts and other foods in it. Is it possible that the after bracha would go by the majority of the other food items or the vast majority of the other food items? So there are two opinions here. One opinion says that you need to have at least a kezayis bichdei achilas pras. That means if you make a loaf of this cake, let's say this cake was made into a loaf, just for example, a loaf of bread. In other words, exactly the same size as a loaf of bread you made this cake into. You need to have the size of an olive of flour within a half a loaf of this bread. If you have that amount, then it's considered like floury cake, and you need to recite the typical after blessing of cake. But what about if you have a very small amount of flour? It's so small that it's less than an olive size in a half a loaf of bread. That means you have less than an olive size of flour in a half a loaf of bread. That's a very tiny amount. Now, you have it there for flavor. And therefore, you need to recite a Bayrei Minim Azainis. You need to recite the beginning bracha for the flour because of the flour content, because everything else is considered nullified to the flour. However, regarding the after blessing, can you say that this is a type of satisfying meal? Is this cake a real satisfying cake that deserves an al hamichya for the grain content or not? Because it has such a small content of grain, meaning you're eating a cake that has so little flour in it, the after bracha possibly loses its status of al hamichya, and everything else takes over. I'll give you an example. An example of this would be, it's not a perfect example, but it would be similar to this type of a case, would be a Larabar. Larabars have a lot of dates in them, but they also have a lot of cashews and peanut butter and chocolate chips, some of them. And because of that, you might not have the size, the proper content of dates in it in order to recite the after blessing of the al ha'etz after blessing. Why? Because even though everything else is nullified to the dates, but the date content might be too small. Again, I have to look up. I know that's discussed in the internet. They tell you what the content is and how much dates are you actually eating in one Larabar. But just the idea that something that's mixed with many other food items, it might become nullified. So there's two opinions here with regard to cake. And these two opinions would, one of them would fit very well with this Rashi's opinion, with what Rashi, the way Rashi is learning this. What do I mean? I mean that you're having this Pasaba B'Kisnin, and Rashi tells us, don't make an Al HaMichya, don't recite the Al HaMichya after blessing. Why are you not meant to recite the Al HaMichya blessing? According to this understanding, the reason why you would not recite an Al HaMichya blessing on this cake is because it has so much filling, it has so much alternative items in it that are not flour, that are not grain-based, that the grain base is so small, it's less than an olive size in the amount of a half a loaf. Because of that, even if you eat an olive size of this cake, but you're eating it so spread out, the flour is so tiny in that amount. And even if you eat a large amount, you're eating such a small amount of flour, it's so spread out that you would not recite an al hamichya. The other opinion says it doesn't matter. Even if you have a tiny amount of flour, the fact that the flour is there to give it flavor, not just to hold it together, therefore it would still be an al hamichya after blessing. So there are two opinions regarding a cake that has very little flour content in it. If the flour is there not just to hold it together, but it's there for flavor, and texture maybe, but it's not there to hold it together. Therefore, there is room to say that Rashi maybe follows that view that you have such a tiny amount, the after blessing would not be an al hamichya after blessing. But again, this is a side point that we're bringing here. The main point that we're talking about here is the bracha on figs and grapes that are brought within a meal. And I see we have 3 questions. I'm guessing that Chag Purim Sameach is Simone.
Oh.
Am I right? Now you're muted, so still don't know. You're muted.
Yeah, I forgot to change the label there.
Okay.
So I'm a little bit confused because when you're talking about the Lara bars, that's not the size of a half a loaf of bread. So it's in proportion to the larger quantity of the item. In fact, I was just going to show you something.
Just imagine putting 25 Lara bars together. So you'd have the size of a loaf of bread. Right. So that tells you exactly what's in that. Yeah, I also got one of those for Shalach Manas. I don't know how it tastes, but she's showing us some type of a bar that has 2 dates in it and 14 peanuts and 3 egg whites. So I'll tell you a little secret. The 1 kazayas and a half a loaf of bread, the proportion is 1/6. If you consider a loaf of bread 3 eggs worth, I'm sorry, 6, and a loaf of bread is 6 eggs, a half a loaf is 3 eggs. So an olive size of flour and a half a loaf of bread of 3 eggs would mean 1 olive in 6 olives. That means 1/6. So if you have less than 1/6 of flour, that would be, according to one opinion, nullified. And if you have less than 1/6 of the ingredients, 1/6 of the proportion of whatever's in that loaf is less than 1/6 is flour, then it would lose, according to this opinion, it loses its al hamichya status. It would still be bari min mazainis, but it would lose its al hamichya status. The other opinion says, no, it doesn't lose the al hamichya status, and it would stay al hamichya. And these 2 views are brought in Shulchan Aruch. They're discussed according to the latest halachic authorities. Yes, let's see. Yehuda, you had a question.
Yeah, you just answered it.
Answered it? Okay. Susan, you had a question.
Okay. The bread that I make it myself. I use 1 cup of oat flour, 1 cup of dates, 1 cup of raisins, and 1 egg.
Okay, so that sounds like it's more than 1/6 is flour. Because you only have like 4 other cups. If you had 5 other cups, then we could start questioning it. But you only have like 3 or 4 other cups. So therefore, you don't have no issue.
Is correct then.
There's no issue whatsoever. It should be hamaitzi. It would seem. It would seem that it should be, unless it's meant to be a cake, but it sounds like it's more bread.
Bread because there's no sugar in it. And there's only one.
And you're eating it as a meal. You're eating it as a meal.
Correct.
Right. It would seem to be
oat flour.
How much water?
None.
No water.
Only 1 egg.
So there's 0 water in it?
Correct. Now the dates and the raisins are cooked.
Doesn't matter.
In 1 cup of water, and after the water disappears, I use the raisins and the dates, and they're wet enough.
Oh, there is a little water from them.
But I would say
very
almost
little.
none.
Right, very little. Right.
But it's oat flour.
Right.
Oat flour.
In any event, the after blessed, the after, you're eating something that's considered flour based.
Correct.
That would be
So
now.
both.
If you want to debate if that's a mezainis or a hamaitzi,
No, I do
it
both
could be
blessings because to me
it could be debatable if that's called cake or bread. But if you're eating it as a meal, I guess that would make it easier. But if you're going to have one little slice of it as a snack, if you're ever going to do that, we might have to think about it more. But in the meantime, you're eating
in the morning. That's my meal. That's it.
Large, right, and you're satisfied from it. You eat it to the amount of satisfaction. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah,
I don't like eggs. I don't like pancakes. That's Chazarah.
Yeah. Okay. In any event, the only question would be how it really depends. The question is how much of it you're eating. You eating a large amount of it, or
1 inch slice, and it's made in a regular loaf pan.
Right, but
all right. So I eat 1 inch slice. That's it.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, it might be
a meal. And it's filling and it's satisfying.
Yeah. It might be questionable if that should be mezainis because it's such a small amount. Maybe after the class, I'll try to look it up.
All right. Thank you.
It's that sounds like a small amount, 1 inch slice of that. I guess we'd have to measure
oat flour is very dense.
Dense, right. Mm-hmm.
So how many slices do you get out of your pan?
Oh my God. I would say 12, more than 12.
Okay. So
Right.
we're talking about 1/12 or more.
Let's say it takes me 3 days to eat the loaf.
Doesn't matter. How many slices do you make? That way you can determine what the volume will be.
And it's all from 1 egg?
Yes. 1 large egg. At least 10 slices, let's say.
Well, it's not just 1 egg. It's a whole cup of raisins and dates.
1 cup of dates.
A lot of liquid. There's a lot of liquidy products there.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
And water and some water residue.
Right. Exactly. Perfect. Yes.
But the problem is that it sounds like it could be considered like a cake as well.
But it's a bread. There's no sugar in it.
But you mean date has sugar and raisins have sugar?
Of course, but
there is sugar.
I don't add sugar. I don't.
Okay. Doesn't mean it's not a cake.
Yeast to it?
No.
Yeast or baking powder? Nothing?
There's baking powder and baking soda, but it's 1 level teaspoon of each.
Right.
That's all.
Yeah. So in any event, it could be debated if that should be more.
Not bread? You don't consider that bread?
It would be somewhere in the middle. It would be a quasi bread, and possibly it could be considered bread, but it's not as simple as it sounds. The best thing would be maybe to eat an olive size of a real oat bread, and then eat this. In other words, have something that's definite bread.
I see.
And eat this. That would be the easiest way to get around.
I understand.
Get around this because you're eating it as bread.
Yes. Sometimes
you're not having the size of a regular meal. You're eating a small amount.
But it's very. I can't even. All right.
Yeah, basically, let me see. Let me read this. Let me just read this one point here.
This for a million years, the same recipe.
Right.
Since I was even 6 years old or something, I don't know. A long time. My grandmother used to make it. She showed me how to make this.
Okay, so let me just tell you.
She was Polish.
So the rabbis established to recite the Birchas Hamazon. You need to have bread, the amount of satisfaction. And the rabbis said that even not, you have to recite a Birchas Hamazon on a kazayas. But it's on the bread that normally are kaiveya suuda. But these type of breads that people aren't normally establishing a meal on, you would not recite a hamaitzi, only mezainis, and afterwards an al hamichya, unless you ate the amount of that people are kaiveya, suuda, which is like a regular meal, morning meal or an evening meal, from regular bread. And then if you eat the same amount of this bread, that would be considered a meal. So if you eat the size of 6 eggs, if you were to eat the size of 6 eggs, which means 12 olive sizes, then you would be able to recite the hamaitzi. No, one second, I'm reading it wrong. If you ate less than 6 eggs and you weren't satisfied, if you ate less than 6 eggs and you weren't satisfied, you make a mezainis. If you ate 6 eggs and you're not satisfied, then you should recite hamaitzi on other bread. Now, if you ate the size of 4 eggs, and you're satisfied, then you can recite hamaitzi on it. So the trick would be to eat 4 eggs worth. If you ate 4 eggs worth, then you can recite hamaitzi on it and Birchas Hamazon, 4 eggs worth. I don't think your inch of it is the same size as 4 eggs. But I do have that
Rabbi,
book.
I'm satisfied.
You're satisfied, but if you're eating less than 4 eggs worth and you're satisfied, you should recite a hamaitzi on real bread the size of an olive, and afterwards you can eat this and you can recite the Birchas Hamazon.
Okay. I understand what you're saying.
So the best would be to eat the size of an olive, either eat 4 eggs worth or eat another real bread,
regular bread, and then have an
olive size, and then you could eat this.
Okay. And I'm not saying any blessings in vain that's what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, or saying the wrong blessing.
Right. Correct. Okay.
And the reason is because this bread that you're eating is not substantial amount of water with the flour. It's like alternative liquids with the flour. And it creates a question of being real bread or quasi bread. Okay, so going back to the Gemara. So again, we're dealing with the dates. I'm sorry, the figs and the grapes. Figs and grapes. That's just the case. The case is figs and grapes. We want to know what the bracha is during a meal, and we had 2 opinions so far. We have Rav Huna and Rav Nachman that both agreed that you don't recite an after bracha on it because the Birchas Hamazon exempts you, but you recite a beginning bracha. And then we have the alternative view, Rav Sheshes, who says you need a bracha before and after. Now, the Gemara now says 2 more points. One is Upliga de Reb Chia. So let's start there. Upliga, and this is about 10 lines up from the bottom of the page. Upliga de Reb Chia, this argues on Reb Chia. So we're on 41b, and we are the Gemara is saying that both of these views argue on Reb Chia. The Amar Reb Chia, because Reb Chia says, Pas paiteras kol mine maichol, bread exempts all types of foods, no matter what they are. During a meal, bread exempts everything. Yayin paiter kol mine mashkim, and wine exempts all types of drinks. When you have wine, even not during a meal, it's going to exempt all drinks. There are different opinions regarding the wine. Do you need to have a substantial amount of wine or even a small amount, a tiny amount of wine or grape juice? But the fact is that if you make a bracha, burpia gofen, you do not need to recite the bracha on drinks. And this is very applicable law, like during a kiddush. If you are drinking, if you had kiddush, you had wine for kiddush, and then they're serving soda. Many people don't know this. Many people would recite a bracha shahakol on the soda, and that's wrong. You don't recite a bracha shahakol on the soda if you heard kiddush, because if you drank wine for kiddush, because if you drank wine for kiddush, then your bracha on the wine, or the bracha on the wine, exempts all types of drinks. Now, there might be room for debate as to maybe you didn't have enough wine or not, but there are views that it's fine. If you drink even a small, tiny amount of wine, you are exempt from the bracha on any other drinks. Now, if you want to have herring at the kiddush, you would need to recite a shahakol on the herring. It's not going to exempt the shahakol on the herring, but it will exempt the shahakol bracha on the other drinks. And the point that we are bringing from Reb Chia is not about the wine part. We're really bringing a point about the bread part. And what is the point about the bread? The point of Reb Chia is that once you're in a meal, bread exempts all foods, everything. Everything is exempt. You don't have to worry about any blessings. Just eat whatever, anything that we don't know the bracha on. You could just eat it, no bracha. You're exempt from everything. That's Reb Chia's view. And this argues on the previous two views, because the previous two views talked about figs and grapes eaten during a meal. And they spoke about the fact that you either need a bracha before it or you need both, before and after. Reb Chia argues on both of them. He says, no, you never need any brachas during a meal. Yes, Yehuda.
Yeah. So when the rabbi makes kiddush in shul, that only he drinks it.
Oh, well, it depends which shul you're going to. Some shuls, they give everyone a little wine.
Okay.
You go to a shul that they charge a little more membership at, and they'll give everyone a little. They give everyone a little wine, not just the rabbi. But if you go to a shul where you don't drink the wine, you're right. If you are not drinking the wine, then you will need to recite a bracha on the Coke or the drinks or the water, whatever you're drinking afterwards, right?
Okay, but even if you're at somebody's house and they give you a little bit of wine, is that still enough?
Yeah, to exempt any drinks, yeah.
Okay.
But again, there is a discussion among the Rishonim about that. Do you need to have a certain amount? Even the Biur Halacha, which is in Shulchan Aruch, talks about maybe you need a certain amount. But there definitely are views that it exempts it, even just a tiny amount. And this is in chapter 174.
There's something about a cheekful.
And it exempts any of the drinks that are there. So that's that's the simple understanding that that it exempts you, even though in the side that they discuss if you didn't have a mole lugma, maybe it shouldn't. There are different views. So there's a Rajba, famous Rajba opinion that you have to be drinking an official meal of wine, but it doesn't seem to be the final. It doesn't seem to be the main view. Seem to be that you drank any amount seems to be good enough.
Thank you.
So what did you say, Simone? I didn't hear what you said.
Oh yeah, I just said, isn't there something about a cheekful? But I think you said that already.
A cheekful
of wine or liquid.
Yeah. So the question really on this Gemara is, who does the halacha? We just said three views. We now have Reb Chia's view, which is you never recite any bracha during a meal. And before we said Rav Huna and Rav Nachman, which felt you say a bracha before. And then we had the view of Rav Sheshes that you say bracha before and after regarding the figs and the grapes. And so we've got these three views. Who do we follow?
We follow the two.
So let's see. So Rav Papa now says, now we have the fourth statement, and this statement is supposed to give us the halacha. So Amar Rav Papa, we're now maybe 8 lines from the bottom of the page, maybe nine lines, 10 lines from the bottom of the page. Amar Rav Papa says, Hilchasa dvarim habayim achmas hasuda, things that come in order to eat the bread with, b'sayich hasuda, in the midst of the meal, ein tu'unin bracha loylafnem b'leilachrem. They don't need a bracha, not before, not after. They're eaten with the bread. They're nullified. They're subservient to the bread. And it doesn't need a bracha before and after. It's eaten with the bread. It doesn't matter if you eat it with the bread or not. It doesn't matter if you normally eat it during a meal or whether it's not normally eaten during a meal. But if you're eating it with the bread, then it is exempt from a bracha. It's covered. It's nullified to the bread. So not that it doesn't matter if you eat it with bread or not. It doesn't matter if you normally have it in a meal or you don't normally have it in a meal. Now you're eating it with bread, it's exempt. That's what this first point is. Now, something that's doesn't come to be a condiment to the bread, and you're eating it in the meal, in other words, to satisfy you. And Rashi gives examples. That it's, he says, like cabbage and beets, that they come to satisfy you, to satiate you, but they're not eaten with bread. These type of foods are tu'un and bracha lefneim. They will need a bracha before because they're satisfying foods. And they don't need a bracha after. Because they're satisfying foods, they don't need a bracha after. But they do need a bracha before. They're not nullified to the bread, but they are nullified to the meal. And because it's not nullified to the bread, it needs a bracha before it. The hamaitzi doesn't cover it, but it's nullified to the meal because they're meant to be satisfying, and therefore they're subservient to the meal, and the berachas hamazon, grace after meal, will exempt them. However, liachar hasuda, things that normally come after a meal, and you're eating them during the meal, but they normally come after the meal. To unim bracha bein lefneim bein lachreim, they will need a bracha before and after. You brought them, you're eating them during the meal. These type of foods, they are meant for sweetness, and therefore not for not to satisfy you. Therefore, it would need a bracha whether before it or after it. Even though you're going to be reciting grace after meal, even though you recited a hamaitzi, it is not exempt as long as you're not eating it with the bread. So, according to Rav Papa, what would be the law with figs and grapes that are eaten during the meal? They served you figs and grapes. What should the halacha be according to the way we've translated the Gemara? That, well, if they're eaten with bread, fine, you don't recite a bracha. If they're not eaten with the bread and they're not meant to satisfy you, well, let's say they are. Let's say they're meant to satisfy you. Figs and grapes, you're not satisfied. You need still more to say you're hungry. And they say, well, we ran out of bread. Let's pull out whatever we have in our refrigerator. We're both still starving. Let's see what we have. And you bring out figs and grapes to satisfy your hunger. And that's all there is. So that's what you're eating to satisfy your hunger. So if you're eating it to satisfy you, then it would seem to be that it would need a bracha before it, but not after, right? Because it's being eaten to satisfy you. But what about the normal case where you do have other food and you're satisfied already and you're eating these as like dessert? You're eating them, as a just a little sweetness between courses. Maybe you want to have some. You want to serve something, make it look nice, fancy meal. You're going to have many courses, so in between the courses, you have a side course, and you have this figs and grapes, and you are going to sweeten your tongue. So, what would the halacha be according to Rav Papa? Anyone?
If it's not satisfying you, then you don't say any bracha on it.
According to who?
If it's betoch in the meal.
According to who?
According to Reb Papa.
No.
I'm sorry, Reb Chia. But you're asking.
Yeah, according to Reb Chia. But I want to know according to Rav Papa.
So according to Rav Papa, you don't say a bracha on it. It's part of the meal. But
which words are you reading that from?
These foods that come not as a result of the meal, but do come during the meal, require blessing before eating them. So you should say a blessing before eating them.
Before? What about after?
After it's covered by hamotzi.
Where do you read that?
These foods come and do not require blessing after eating them. So you don't have a separate.
Which ones?
The foods that come during the meal. The foods that come during the meal.
Maybe that's if they're satisfied.
Well, I don't think he mentioned satisfying. He just talked about whether it comes before or after. But if you're eating grapes and figs, usually that would be closer to a dessert, and I would say it comes after the meal.
Okay. So why are you bringing that halacha? That's not the case, really. In other words, what you're reading from is not really our case. Our case is really the example of after the meal. Now, the way we translated it to mean is something that normally comes after the meal. You're eating it during the meal, but it normally comes after a meal. And in that case, what did it say in Rav Papa? What did anyone? What does Rav Papa say? Stuff that normally comes after a meal. What would the bracha? Would you need to recite a bracha? So he concludes and says that you need to recite a bracha before it and after. It's eaten during the meal, but it's something that normally would come after a meal, like dessert. Because it normally would come after a meal, you would need to recite a bracha before it and after it, meaning it's something that's not satisfying. That's the word. In other words, this is the terminology that the Rav Papa, the way we're translating it for Rav Papa to mean what's during a meal, what's after a meal means what's for satisfaction, and what's to satiate you, and what is for pleasure and enjoyment. And so he's using that term. Something normally comes after a meal, meaning it's for pleasure, for that it's would be this figs and these grapes, and therefore you would need a bracha before it, and you would need a bracha after it.
So I'm missing that. Where is Reb Papa referring to satisfaction?
When he uses the word li'achar haseuda, something that's after a meal, meaning normally it comes after a meal.
Why don't we just understand it as it comes after a meal, like dessert at the end of the meal?
Yeah, okay, that's fine. But did you recite the Brochos Hamazon yet or not? You could. You could translate it that way. That's fine. But what my point is that even if you want to say that he's referring to after a meal, meaning after Brochos Hamazon, all he's saying is that it's normally comes after Brochos Hamazon. And here, even if it didn't come after Brochos Hamazon, but it normally does, you would need to recite a bracha before it and after. But if you want to translate it that it means before Brochos Hamazon, then you're all set. Of course, it would be the same thing. You would need a bracha before it and after it. Now, again, this is the way Rashi learns. The other commentaries they're going to be another way that they learn, but that's what comes out from this. So let's summarize what we have here. We've got the Gemara's question is, what bracha do you recite on figs and grapes during a meal? So we've got Rav Huna and Rav Nachman. Say a bracha before it. We've got Rav Sheshes. Say a bracha before it and after it. We've got a Rav Chia who says, don't say a bracha before it or after. So we've got all three options. No brachas, all brachas, or one yes and one not, right? That's what we have so far. Rav Chia says 0 brachas. Rav Sheshes says all brachas. Rav Huna, Rav Nachman says in between, you got to say a bracha before it, but you don't have to recite a bracha after. Now, Rav Papa is going to come along now and tells us, so what's the halacha? Hilchasa. Rav Papa says the halacha follows this thing. Hilchasa is what Rav Papa says. Rav Papa Hilchasa, and what it sounds like, according to the way we learned, which is Rashi's the way we understand Rashi, what comes out is that who is the halacha like? What do we just say? What does Rav Papa hold? You need a bracha before it and after it? Is that what we said? According to Rav Papa, you're eating these figs and these grapes during the meal for pleasure. What does Rav Papa hold? You need a bracha before it and after it. So who does that go like? Which one of the three?
Rav Sheshes.
Rav Sheshes. So according to Rashi, Rav Papa is telling us the halacha follows Rav Sheshes. That's the way Rashi learns. That the Gemara now tells us the halacha follows Rav Sheshes. Now, the other way of learning is, we're going to translate the Gemara a little differently. And the way we're going to translate the Gemara is that Amar Rav Papa says, Hilchasa, the halacha is, Devarim haboyim machmas hasuda. Again, we're starting with Rav Papa here. And Rav Papa is giving us the halacha, things that come because of a meal, but not because they're eaten with bread. Eaten with bread, of course, it's exempt from bread, Tosfos says. So Tosfos says you can't learn like Rashi, something that comes to eat the bread with it. You need Rav Papa to tell us the halacha over there. Of course, something eaten with bread, peanut butter smeared on bread, of course, is going to be, you don't say a bracha on the peanut butter. There's no question. Jam on top of bread, you're not going to recite the bracha on jam. That's not where Rav Papa is coming to tell us. That's something that we know already. It's so obvious. It's totally nullified, subservient to the bread. That we're talking about things that are boyim machmas hasuda. They're coming during the meal for satisfaction. The soich hasuda. They don't need a bracha not before it and not after it. They're meant to be during the meal. Now, what about foods that are not? And foods that do not come because of the meal. In the meal. Tu'unim bracha lefneim, they do need a bracha before it. Ve'ein tu'unim bracha la'achreim, they don't need a bracha afterwards. So the way Tosfos is learning, this is the Tosfos li'achar, the second to last Tosfos on the page. Li'achar hasu'uda. This is the next case. I'm sorry. The first two cases that Rav Papa says is food that belongs during the meal. In other words, it's part of the meal, and food that's not exactly part of the meal. And in other words, it's not meant to be satisfying. Then you need a bracha before it, and you don't need a bracha after it. And then this Tosfos Le'achar HaSeuda talks about a case that they used to push aside the bread even during the meal, but they would put aside the bread and take it back into the kitchen or whatever, and they would separate. They would say, we're not having any more bread now. And that's the case that is Le'achar HaSeuda, the final case. Things not that they're normally eaten after a meal, it's things that after they remove the bread from the table, then you want to eat stuff, you need a bracha before it and after it. So according to this way of understanding, so there's food that's meant to be, you got three cases here. You got food that's meant to be part of the meal, meaning for satiation. You have food that's not meant for satiation, but it's not really part of the meal. That's more like dessert food. That you need a bracha before it and not after it. And then you have food that's eaten after they remove the bread completely, and they say we're not eating anymore. And then you decide you want to eat more, you need a bracha before it and after. In other words, when they remove the bread, it's like we're not having any more food. When you decide, oh, you know what, I want more. So then you would need to recite a bracha before it and after.
We do something like that at the Seder, where we take the matzah off the table.
So we do something like that at the Seder. What are you referring to?
This is some point where we
cover the matzah at different times during the meal, right? We
Isn't
cover
there a point?
it. Right, we push it aside, we cover it.
Right, we push it aside. And I think it's like based on that time when they would do that.
Similar, you're right. Right, good point. In other words, they're hinting as if we're not eating it anymore, and really, we are going to be eating it. So obviously, it's not exactly the same, but it's right. It's based on this idea of pushing it aside, and it's almost like we're not eating anymore. The kids have to start asking questions. What do you mean? Aren't we going to eat? But it's similar to this. Now we don't do this anymore. This concept, this halacha doesn't apply anymore. Tosfos makes a very important mention of this idea. He says, "V'achshav ein lanu din zeh." Nowadays we don't have this halacha. The halacha doesn't apply. There's no such thing. If you remove everything from the table, you're still planning on eating. We still expect you to eat a little. You might, nowadays we don't, you might still want to eat something. So we don't have this halacha of mashach yodeinu min hapas. We draw our hands away from eating anymore. Actually, the term I should clarify. The term that they use is not that you remove the bread from the table, but you remove your hands from the bread. That's really the term used. Mashchu yadayim min hapas. Once you remove your hands from the bread, it's no longer a meal anymore. Whatever you're eating now is like it's not part of the meal. But again, this halacha doesn't apply anymore. And when does it apply? Only if you bench. Once you bench, then fine, then it's over. The meal is over. But as long as you didn't bench, you're eating dessert, you're schmoozing, we still think that we might have bread. Okay, so what comes out according to this? So if you're eating some foods that are meant to be part of a meal, like meat or fish or rice, green beans, so those do not need any bracha before it or after, according to Tosfos. But what about if you're having figs and grapes? So that would be the second case of Rav Papa. And what does it say in the second case of Rav Papa? He says, Shaloi machmas hasuda b'sei hasuda. It's not part of a meal, but you're eating it during the meal. You need a bracha before it and not after. So who is, according to Tosfos, who's Rav Papa following? Which view is Rav Papa following? Rav Papa is following the view that you recite a bracha before it and not after. Again, Rashi learned that Rav Papa is saying you need a bracha before it and after, because Rav Papa's case was the third case is what we're really needing. But in other words, the reason we brought Rav Papa was for his third case, according to Rashi, because his third case talks about foods that are not normally eaten during a meal. It's more for pleasure. And that third case of Rav Papa is what's applicable to our Gemara. And the way Rashi learned, it proved Rav Sheshis. According to Tosfos, we really want the second statement of Rav Papa. And the second statement of Rav Papa was that something is not because of a Suda, you're eating it during a meal, but it's not because of the meal, and you need a bracha before it and not after it. That's not like Rav Sheshis. That means he's following which views? Again, you're having figs and grapes, and you need a bracha before it and not after it. Who said that? You need a bracha before it and not after it. Who says you need a bracha before it?
Rav Sheshis.
No, Rav Sheshis says you need a bracha before and after. Who says you need a bracha before it and not after? Yes, Susan.
Rav Papa.
Rav who?
Rav Papa.
Yeah, but who is he following? I want to know who Rav Papa is going according to.
Who is he following?
Which of the three views? We either have
Hamana.
The answer is either Rav Huna, Rav Nachman, Rav Sheshis, or Rav Chia. You got to pick one of the three. Rav Huna, Rav Nachman is A, Rav Sheshis is B, and Rav Chia is C. Who is Rav Papa following? A. Rav Huna and Rav Nachman.
Yeah.
A, yes.
A. So Rav Papa is following Rav Huna, Rav Nachman. Now Tosfos says this is the final halacha. So Tosfos follows his way of understanding the Gemara, and he says, and this is the final halacha, like Rav Papa says. But now let's take this a step further. So the halacha does not follow Reb Chia, right? And according to Rashi, it also doesn't follow Reb Chia. Rashi learned it follows Rav Sheshis. Tosfos says it follows Rav Huna, Rav Nachman. So the halacha does not follow Reb Chia. So what should the halacha be regarding wine? If you recite a bracha on wine, does it exempt drinks? Reb Chia said two things. He said, if you have these foods during a meal, you never recite a bracha on foods during a meal. And if you have drinks during a wine tasting, you never recite a bracha on drinks during wine, when you have wine. So should the halacha, what should the halacha be with regard to wine? Are you going to be exempt from brachas on other drinks? We just said that Rashi holds like Rav Sheshis. Tosfos holds like Rav Huna, Rav Nachman. No one seems to hold like Reb Chia. So Reb Chia was the one who said that if you have wine, all the drinks are exempted. So should the halacha follow Reb Chia, if we don't really hold like Reb Chia?
As far as drinks, I think yes.
So Ben wants to say that, listen, no one talked about drinks. So no one argued on Reb Chia regarding drinks. So maybe we should follow Reb Chia regarding drinks. Tosfos doesn't seem to like that. He says that less hilchasa kavosei, the halacha doesn't follow him. We don't hold like Reb Chia. And because we don't follow Reb Chia regarding the bread, so also what he says regarding the wine, we also don't follow Reb Chia. However, Shulchan Aruch argues on Tosfos, and we follow the other Rishonim. The Shulchan Aruch follows the other commentaries that argue on Tosfos. But Tosfos here says we don't actually follow this halacha about wine, and Tosfos is basically saying that the logic of Reb Chia is not the accepted logic. And his logic of wine exempting all drinks is the same as the bread meal exempting all foods during a meal. So Tosfos says if we don't follow Reb Chia regarding the bread exempting all foods, we shouldn't follow Reb Chia regarding the drinks, that wine should exempt all drinks. But the other Rishonim say, the way Ben was thinking, and that is that it's not really based one on the other. No one argued on Reb Chia regarding drinks, and therefore the halacha should follow Reb Chia regarding drinks, even though we don't follow Reb Chia regarding the other foods. And that's what's brought in Shulchan Aruch, as Ben mentioned, and as I mentioned earlier, that wine does exempt other drinks. So Tosfos would argue with that, but the Shulchan Aruch doesn't seem to follow Tosfos in this case. We follow the other Rishonim, the other commentaries. Okay, any questions?
I wasn't quite clear. So let's say you go to an Israeli restaurant and they serve you the warm pizza, and you've washed your pizza, and then they put out all those little dishes. Some has cabbage, and some have beets, and some have olives, and some of those little appetizers. So do you need to say a separate bracha on them? Is that part of the meal, or is that not part of the meal?
So according to the halacha, you don't need to recite a bracha on them. They are considered part of the meal. Again, we're following Tosfos, and there's no question. Now, according to Rashi, if you wanted to figure out what would the halacha be according to Rashi, so those are actually meant to be eaten with the bread, a lot of them, because there's hummus, and there's tahina, and there's egg salad, and they have other things that you're meant to like dip your bread in and eat them, at least some of them. The truth is, I don't know for sure. I guess we have to ask an Israeli to be sure exactly all the details. But the chatzelim thing, I think they expect you to dip. They give you pita, so they expect you to dip your bread into it. So that is no question whatsoever that it should be exempted from a bracha, because you're eating your bread with it.
Right, but they have these other things. It's usually like chopped up cabbage, and cabbage is mentioned specifically as one of the things.
Right. So you have one or two things that I guess, again, I mentioned we should ask an Israeli to find out if what they mean when they give the cabbage. Is that also meant for you to eat with the bread or not? Again, you're right that here Rashi does give cabbage as an example of something not eaten with bread. But I would still say that if you go to a Israeli restaurant and doesn't mean that the same tradition applied what they did in Rashi's day as in today. So it could be that nowadays the cabbage is eaten, but I don't know. I don't think you're right. I don't know if cabbage is eaten with the bread, but again, we should find out. But let's say it's not eaten with the bread. So then you have you have to figure out two things. Number one, is this something meant as an appetizer to get you to eat the meal? It's like getting your hunger there, to developing an appetite, or is it another food item that doesn't belong with the bread? So if you want to say it's not like an appetizer, but it's more like another food item, it would seem, and surprisingly so, would seem you might need to recite a bracha according to Rashi. Again, we don't follow this, so it's not, you're asking a question that's theoretical, it's not practical, because the Shulchan Aruch doesn't follow Rashi here. But in theory, if you wanted to know what Rashi would hold, it could be that it depends if it's something to develop an appetite, or if it's something to be a satisfying food that doesn't go with the bread, and it would need a bracha before it. So in theory, you could look into it and see if that would seem to be.
Chamutzim is to make you thirsty to drink.
To get you to buy a drink at $5 when you could buy it next door for 50 cents. Right. Right. Interesting. Is that really the reason the chamutzim is to get you to drink, or you're joking?
It's a taste. It's to add taste to whatever you're eating, and makes you thirsty.
Right.